Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to part 3 of The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz de Castillo. I left off part 2 at the moment where Cortez is sitting in or staying in the main city of the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. We return to the narrative at the point where Cortez decides to take Montezuma, the head of the Aztecs, hostage. Quote, a council was now called, composed of Cortez as president, with 4 captains and 12 soldiers, whereof I was one. And having duly considered how evidently the Lord guided us, and what wise and valiant captains and brave soldiers we had, and also the fickle disposition of the Indians, who though now kind to us might change, there was no laying how soon, and that notwithstanding the hospitality with which Montezuma treated us, he might at any moment fall into an opposite line of conduct, we resolved to follow the opinion of Cortez by adopting the most effectual measure, which was to seize and make that monarch our prisoner. As we could not know at what moment we might be perhaps poisoned in our food, and as no gift of his nor all his father's treasure could make compensation to us for the alarms and distressing thoughts which filled the minds of those of any reflection. For these reasons it was therefore agreed to adopt the measure without delay. The captains who were present proposed that Montezuma should be induced by a plausible pretext to come into our quarters, and when there to seize him, and if he resisted, to make his person answer it. And they urged that of the 2 great dangers, this was much the least. It was then observed by some of our soldiers that Montezuma's officers did not provide us so plentifully as first, and 2 of our Talascan allies had told our interpreter, Aguilar, in confidence, that they observed a bad disposition on the part of the Mexicans toward us for the last 2 days. This debate lasted a full hour. At length it was agreed to adjourn until the next day, and in the meantime we insulted our Reverend Father of the Order of Mercy, praying to God to guide us in this difficulty. On the day after this debate, arrived 2 Indians of Tlaxcala very secretly, with letters from Villamica, whereby we were informed that Juan de Escalante had fallen, together with 6 soldiers, in a battle with the Mexicans, and that the inhabitants of the mountains and of Sempoal were in commotion, and refused to supply provisions or to work, so that the garrison knew not what to do. These letters added that the opinion of the Indians were much altered since they found that the Spaniards could be killed like other men. God knows this intelligence afflicted us. It was the first defeat that we had experienced since we landed on that continent, and here let the reflecting reader ponder upon the changes which fate makes in the affairs of men. We who yesterday were honored by Montezuma in possession of wealth and considered invulnerable like demigods, today found ourselves lured in the consideration of the natives to a level with them in whose power we were. We now therefore saw in a stronger point of view than ever how necessary it was for our very existence to seize Montezuma, and that if we failed, we might as well perish in the attempt as meet our certain fate in any other way. But before I go farther, I will give an account of the misfortune which befell Juan de Escalante. I have already related that in a town named Quiabuistlan, about 30 chiefs of the neighboring districts had voluntarily come under our own government. A Mexican garrison, it appears, attempted to levy contributions upon some of these people. When this was represented to Escalante, the commandant in Villa Rica, he sent word to the officers of Montezuma to desist, threatening them in case they did not, but at the same time expressing his wishes to be on friendly terms with them. To this an abrupt reply was returned, that he should find them in the field. Escalante was a man who had blood in his eye, and on receiving the answer he immediately prepared 40 of his own people and 2,000 of his allies, and put himself in a march against the Mexicans, whom he met out upon a pillaging expedition and attacked. Our allies, who were always afraid of the Mexicans, fled at the first shower of arrows, and left the poor Spaniards to get out of the business as well as they could. With great difficulty they arrived in Almeria, where Escalante and 6 soldiers soon died of their wounds. One soldier they took alive. His name was Arguello, a native of Leon. This man had a large head and a thick curled beard, and was great bodily strength. Such is the truth of the affair at Almeria, which is entirely different from the account of the historian Gomara, where he lays that Pedro de Ircio went to colonize Panuco with a party of soldiers at a time when we had not a sufficiency of men to keep up our guards. In many things which that historian relates concerning the seizure of Montezuma, he ought to have recollected that eyewitnesses to that transaction were yet alive to contradict him. The Mexican captains reported the affair to Montezuma, and presented him with the head of the Spanish soldier, who died of his wounds, as they were bringing him prisoner. It is said that Montezuma trembled when he beheld it, and ordered it to be sent elsewhere. He asked his captains why, being so numerous, they had not conquered such a handful of men. They replied that the reason was because they beheld a supernatural being who encouraged the Spaniards and struck terror into their people, and this Montezuma believed could be no other than the Holy Virgin Mary, with her son in her arms, as we had explained to him that she was our patroness. This I cannot testify to, not having been there myself, but some of those who were there assured me the truth of it, which was the universal belief amongst us. Would to God that it were so. Certain, however, it is that the divine mercy which was with us throughout, for which praised be God. It having been decided that we should seize the person of the king, we passed the whole of the preceding night in praying to our Lord, that he would be pleased to guide us, so that we were about to do would redound to his holy service. And in the morning, 8 days after the arrival of the Spaniards in Mexico, we proceeded to arrange the manner in which our determination was to be carried into effect. Our cavalry and infantry were as usual in readiness to turn, but if called upon. And as it was always our custom to go fully armed, the appearance in that manner gave no suspicion. Cortez, having left our whole force in readiness, proceeded to the palace, attended by the captains Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, de Leon, de Lugo, de Avila, with the interpreters Donna Marina and Aguilar, sending before him to acquaint the king that he was on his way to pay him a visit. This he did in order to prevent any effect arising from an unexpected appearance. The king concluded that it was on account of the affair of Almeria that Cortez was enraged about that which in reality he did not care the value of a chestnut for, and sent word back to Cortez that he was welcome. Accordingly, our general, and we who attended him, having entered into the presence of Montezuma after paying him his respects, he addressed the king through his interpreter, saying he was astonished that a monarch who was so brave, who had shown himself so friendly to us, should have given orders to his troops in Tuzopan to attack the Spaniards, kill one of them and his horse, and pillage and destroy our allies. Cortez wished to conceal the death of Escalante and the 6 others. He then charged the king with the treacherous attempt against us in Cholula, which he said he had hitherto been deterred from speaking of by motives of esteem and regard, but that now, in addition to those provocations, his officers were plotting our immediate destruction, and he concluded by saying that in order to prevent the ruin of the city, it was necessary that his majesty should, peaceably, and without making any opposition or remonstrance, immediately go with us to our quarters, where he should be treated with the greatest respect, but that if he said one word or gave at least alarm, the 5 captains then present would instantly put him to death. On hearing this, Montezuma was at first so terrified that he appeared to have lost all sensation. Having recovered himself a little, he denied his ever giving any order of his troops to attack our countrymen, and taking from his wrist the signet of Huitzilopochtli, with which he was used to confirm any order of great importance, he caused the officer of whom complaint had been made to be sent for. He then replied to the proposal of leaving his palace, and summoning up his dignity, said that he was not the person to be forced to take such a step contrary to his inclination. The conversation was prolonged, Cortez giving him good reasons for what he proposed, and the king replying to him with better, insomuch that above a half an hour had now elapsed. The captains who were standing by began at last to grow very impatient, and De Leon cried out to Cortez in his rough voice, "Why, sir, do you waste so many words? Let him yield himself to our prisoner, or we will this instant plunge our swords into his body. Tell him this, and also, that if he says a word, he dies for it. Better for us to allure our lives now, or perish at once." The manner in which this was spoken struck the king, and he asked Donna Marina the meaning of it. She, with her usual readiness, answered by requesting that he would immediately consent to what was proposed to him, and go where he should meet all respect and honor. If she perceived that he hesitated, they were resolved to put him to instant death. He then addressed Cortez and said, "I have a legitimate son and 2 legitimate daughters. Take them as hostages for me, but do not expose me as a prisoner to my own people." Cortez, however, replied, saying nothing but what was originally proposed could do, and that remonstrances were unavailing. At length he was forced to consent, upon which our captains addressed him with every declaration of esteem and respect, earnestly desiring that he would not be offended at what had passed, and that he would tell his officers and guards that he went by his own free will, and by the advice of his gods and priests. This magnificent litters were now brought, and attended by his usual guards, he proceeded to our quarters, where our post and sentinels being duly placed, he was received and entertained with every mark of respect. He was soon waited on by the princes of his family and the chief nobility of Mexico, who came to know the cause of the step that he had taken, and also if it was his wish that they should attack us. But he replied that it was his intention to stay with us for a few days, and that whatever further commands he had for them, he would signify in due time, but charge them with nothing to disturb the city. Thus was the seizure of the great Montezuma effected. He was attended while he was with us in the same manner as his own palace. His wives, family, and officers were with him, and he bathed every day. He appeared calm and resigned, and had always in his presence 20 counselors or chiefs. Ambassadors came to him on affairs of importance from distant countries, to either deliver tribute or with business which he had dispatched. I recollect that however great the prince or chief might be, before he entered the king's presence he took off his rich dress, and put on a plain one of the coarse manufacture of Nequin, and in this habit, and barefooted, approached the royal apartments, which he entered, not directly, but by making a circuit by the wall. And having come, with his eyes cast down upon the ground, into the presence of the king, he made 3 profound bows, and addressed him, calling him Lord, my Lord, great Lord. He then displayed before him a cloth whereon was painted and represented the business on which he came, the particulars of which he pointed out to him with little rods or wands, delicately wrought and polished. During this time 2 old lords stood by the king, and as soon as they attentively considered with all the particulars, they gave their opinions upon it to Montezuma, who dispatched the affair with a few words. The person who had brought it then, without making any reply, withdrew from the king's presence, making 3 profound bows, and keeping his face toward the throne till out of sight. And as soon as he was out of the royal apartments, he put on his rich dress and walked about the city. The messengers who, as it had been mentioned, were dispatched with the royal signet to arrest and bring to Mexico the officers of whom our general had complained, soon returned with them. Upon their arrival and being brought into the monarch's presence, I do not know what passed, but he immediately sent them to Cortez to do with them as he thought fit. Being examined when the king was not by, they avowed all that had happened, and said that they did it by the orders of Montezuma, which were, that if should it be necessary recur to force, to obtain the tribute due, and attack the Spaniards if they appeared in support of his refractory subjects. Montezuma being charged by Cortez with this, which now appeared, he endeavored to exculpate himself as well as he could. But Cortez told him that although his participation in the guilt of his officers was evident, and although the orders of our monarch were to punish with death all who inflicted death, yet such was his regard for him that he would sooner lose his own life than do his majesty an injury. All these assurances, however, could not remove the fears of Montezuma. As to the officers, Cortez sentenced them to be burnt alive in front of the palace of their king. This was immediately proceeded upon during the time of its taking place, and in order to prevent any impediment occurring, he also ordered that Montezuma should be put in irons. When this was doing, the unfortunate king could no longer suppress his emotions at the indignity, but wept aloud. In this situation he remained until the execution was over, at which time Cortez, attended by his 5 captains, went to his apartment, and with his own hands freed him from the irons, alluring him that he was dearer to him than even a brother, and that he trusted soon to be able to make his dominions exceed double their present extent, and also that if he wished to go to his palace, he was at perfect liberty to do so. Montezuma's spirit was now broke, and the tears ran down his cheeks while Cortez was speaking. He declined the offer with thanks, knowing well the emptiness of his words, and added, he considered it most prudent to remain where he was in order to prevent disturbance and insurrection in the city. What we understood, and certainly was the case, was that Cortez had caused the interpreters to say that though he was inclined to release him, the other officers never would allow it. As soon as Montezuma had given his answers, Cortez threw his arms around his neck and protested that he loved him as himself. The king then asked of him his page Orteguilla, a youth who had already learned the language, and Cortez immediately complied with his request, whereupon Orteguilla afterwards remained about the person of the king, a circumstance very useful to both him and to us. Montezuma was very partial to the youth, from whom he was constantly used to inquire particulars relative to Europe, and Orteguilla, from his knowledge of the language, was able to communicate to us whenever he observed, and that was of great importance for us to know. Thus Montezuma remained amongst us, treated with the greatest respect, no officer or soldier or even Cortez himself coming into his pretense or passing him without pulling off his helmet, as he always treated us most kindly and courteously. The officers of Montezuma were publicly executed, as I have related, were 4 in number. Their names were Quetzal Papoca, who was the principal, Coatl, Quiabuitli, and another whom I have forgotten, nor is it of much importance. As soon as this chastisement was known throughout the different provinces of New Spain, it struck universal terror, and the people on the coast returned to their submission. Now let the curious consider upon our heroic actions. First, in destroying our ships and therewith all hope of retreat. Secondly, in entering the capital of Mexico after the alarming warnings that we had received. Thirdly, in daring to make prisoner the great Montezuma, king of all that country, and putting the king in irons during the execution. Now that I am old, I frequently revolve and reflect upon the events of that day, which appear to me as fresh as if they had just paled. Such is the impression they have made upon my mind. I say that it was not we who did these things, but that all was guided by the hand of God, for which men on earth would otherwise have ventured, their numbers not amounting to 450, to have seized and put in irons a mighty monarch, and publicly burned his officers for obeying his orders, in a city larger than Venice, and at a distance of 1,500 leagues from their native country. There is much matter for reflection in this, and it merits to be detailed otherwise than in a dry manner in which I relate it. Cortes now thought it necessary to appoint a commandant at Villarica. For this purpose he chose Alonso de Grado, an indifferent soldier, but a person of good understanding who spoke well and was of a handsome appearance. He was also a musician and an excellent penman. He was always in opposition to Cortes relative to our advance to Mexico, and was the principal orator on those occasions. Cortes, when he gave him the appointment, good-humoredly said to him, "Now, Senor de Grado, go and possess your wishes. You are commandant of Villarica, and see that you fortify it well. And mind, I charge you on no account to go out and fight the wicked Indians, nor let them kill you as they did Juan de Escalante." This Cortes said ironically, knowing the condition of the man, and that all the world could not have got to him to put his nose out of the town. We who were listening to this and perceived his drift could hardly forbear laughing aloud. He then gave him his instructions to behave kindly to his Indian neighbors and not permit them to be robbed or oppressed. He also desired to cause the smiths who were in that settlement to make 2 large chains out of the old iron of the ships and send them to him immediately, and lose no time in proceeding with the construction of the wooden fort. When de Grado arrived at his government, he affected to carry on business with a lofty demeanor, and sent to the neighboring Indians who were at peace with us, requiring them to give him gold and female slaves, paying no attention whatever to the fortifications, but passing his time in feasting and play. What was worse, he combined with the adherents of Velasquez, offering to put him in possession of the post he was entrusted with. These things being soon communicated to Cortes, he repented for his imprudent step in appointing to such a place a man whose bad disposition he knew well. He also foresaw that Velasquez must sooner or later find out that he had lent agents to Old Castile, and would probably send a force against us. For these reasons, it was necessary that he should have a person of confidence in command at Villarica. Therefore he sent Sandoval, who was now Alguazil Mayor, with whom went Pedro de Irrichio, already mentioned, who gained the confidence of Sandoval, a good-natured man, by diverting him with anecdotes of the families of the Count de Urena and Don Pedro Giron, which he had served. De Irrichio, by means of this, gained favor so completely that he never ceased promoting him till he had got him the rank of captain, instead of which promotion, for the licenses he gave his tongue, for which Sandoval at times reprehended him, he deserved to have been well punished. Sandoval, on his arrival at Villarica, immediately arrested de Grado and sent him prisoner to Mexico under a guard of Indians, according to the orders of Cortes. The new governor soon made himself very popular among the natives for his affability and humanity, and he immediately began to put the fort into proper repair. Cortes would not see de Grado on his arrival, but confined him to the stocks, where he remained for 2 days. I recollect that the timber whereof these things were made has a strong smell of garlic. De Grado, who was a man of great plausibility, at last made his peace, and was employed, not in a military capacity, but in one conformable to his talents, being given the office of contador, which had been held by Avila, who was sent as pure procurador to the island of St. Domingo. Sandoval had orders to send the ironwork necessary for the construction of 2 vessels, which he punctually executed, and the various articles arrived safely in Mexico. Cortes, regularly every day after Mass, went to wait on Montezuma, attended by all his officers, and asked him what he would be pleased to order that they could execute, to which the king used to answer, thanking him. He found himself perfectly to his satisfaction. Thus, from one subject to another, they usually fell into discourse about our holy faith and the power of our emperor. At other times, Montezuma and Cortes used to play a certain game which they called totoloque, in which they take aim with golden balls at certain objects also made of gold. I remember once in particular when Cortes and Alvarado were playing against Montezuma and his nephew. Montezuma jocularly said that he would not allow Tony Atio, meaning Alvarado, so called on his account of his handsome person, that word meaning the sun, to mark, expressing himself in such a manner as to imply that Alvarado did not say which was true, at which we all burst out laughing, because Alvarado was a little addicted to exaggeration. When Cortes gained, he gave his winnings to those about Montezuma, and when the king gained, he did the same to our soldiers of the guard. Indeed, he never let a day pass without making presents of some kind to all of us, but more particularly to Velasquez de Leon, who was the captain of his guard, and always paid him great attention. One night a soldier named Trujillo was guilty of a certain piece of disrespect within his hearing, at which Montezuma was highly offended, and inquired of the page who the person was. The page told him that he was a man of low birth who knew no better. He then proceeded to tell him of our different ranks and qualities, about which he was very curious. On the next day, he ordered Trujillo to be brought into his presence, and after having reproved him, he made him a present worth about 5 crowns. The words of Montezuma made less impression on the soldier than his gold, and on the next night the fellow was guilty of the same piece of impoliteness in order to get more. Of this Montezuma complained to Velasquez, who ordered the man to be relieved and severely reprimanded him. Another soldier one night complained that he was ill, cursing this dog of an Indian, meaning Montezuma, who gave them so much trouble. This being overheard by the king, who discovered what he had said, he complained thereof to Cortez, by whose command the man was immediately whipped, notwithstanding he was a very good soldier. His name was Pedro Lopez. After this example, strict discipline and silence were kept by the guard, to the great satisfaction of the king, who was very kind to us, knew us all, and spoke to us by our names. I was at this time a stripling, and always behaved to him with great respect. His page had told him that I had been twice upon his coast before the arrival of Cortez, and I desired the page to mention to him that instead of gold or mantles, he would oblige by giving me a handsome Indian girl. This request he graciously complied with, calling me to him, saying, Bernal Diaz de Castillo, the young woman I present to you is the daughter of one of my principal nobility. Treat her well, and her friends will give you gold and mantles, as much as you can desire. I kissed his majesty's hand, thanking him for his favors and praying to God to prosper him, to which Montezuma replied, saying, It seems to me that Del Castillo is of a noble condition. Wherewith he ordered me 3 plates of gold and 2 loads of mantles. I will now relate some more particulars of his course of life. In the morning, having paid his devotions, he ate a slight breakfast, not of meats but vegetables, such as agi or pepper, and then remained a full hour hearing business in the manner I have already described. The number of judges or counselors who attended upon him at those times amounted to 20. His numerous mistresses he used to marry to his officers and particular friends. Some of them fell to our lot. Mine was called Donna Francisca, a lady of high birth, as she shewed by her manners. Thus sometimes amusing himself and sometimes meditating on his situation, the great Montezuma passed the days of his confinement amongst us. The materials being arrived, Cortez requested that the king would give him permission to construct 2 vessels for the purpose of amusing himself upon the water, and also that he would order his carpenters to assist. The oak timber was only at the distance of about 4 leagues, and Montezuma having given his consent, the work went on so expeditiously by the number of Indian carpenters, and was so ably conducted by our principal builder, Martin Lopez, that in a very short space of time they were built, launched, and rigged, with an awning over each. Montezuma at this time requested permission from Cortez to pay his devotions and perform sacrifices, in order that his friends and subjects might see that he lived among us by the order of his gods and his own choice. Cortez returned for answer, and that in doing so, it was his business to beware how he did anything whereby to lose his life. For that he would send a guard of officers and soldiers with him, giving them strict orders to kill him instantly, in case there appeared to be anything like a commotion. With this caution he gave him his permission to visit his temple. It was also at the same time signified to him that no human sacrifice would be permitted, to which Montezuma having agreed, he set out in his usual pomp, and accompanied by 4 of our captains, Velasquez, de Leon, Alvarado, Avila, and de Lugo, with 150 soldiers. Our reverend father in the Order of Mercy also attended for the purpose of preventing human sacrifice. Montezuma, on his arrival to the temple, came out of his litter and was supported up to it as usual, being met by a number of priests. They had on the preceding night sacrificed 4 Indians, nor could all our endeavors prevent that inhuman practice, which we were for the present obliged to connive at, seeking to do anything which would cause an insurrection. After Montezuma had stayed a short time at his devotions, he came down from the temple and returned to our quarters in great good humor, making presents to all of us who attended him upon the occasion. The vessels were now afloat upon the lake, fully equipped and manned with expert sailors, and they obeyed both sail and oar, so as to answer our utmost expedition. When Montezuma was informed of it, he requested Cortez to permit him to go hunting in a certain district, which was prohibited to all others on pain of death. Cortez assented, warning him that his life paid for the forfeit of any attempt at a rescue, and he offered him the use of his ships to go there, which Montezuma was greatly pleased with and accepted. The swiftest sailing vessel conveyed the king and his suite, and the other was occupied by his son and a number of the nobility. All were attended also by a vast number of boats, great and small. Cortez ordered out a party composed of Velasquez, de Leon, Alvarado, de Oli, and Avila, all men who had blood in their eyes, and 200 soldiers, giving them orders to be very watchful over Montezuma. 4 brass guns with their ammunition and artillerymen were also embarked. A wind blew very fresh. Our sailors took delight in exhibiting their skill, and the ship seemed to fly across the lake, leaving the vessels of the natives far behind. Montezuma, being arrived where he was to hunt, landed for that purpose, and the place abounded with game. He had soon killed a great quantity of various kinds, such as deer, hares, and rabbits. After having amused himself for some time in this manner, he returned on board the vessel and set sail for Mexico. We discharged our artillery during the voyage, which afforded him amusement and satisfaction, and he delighted us all by his affable and friendly behavior. Nor is it possible to describe how noble he was in everything he did, nor the respect in which he was held by everyone about him. One day, 3 of our captains were in his presence when a hawk entered the apartments pursuing a quail, which kind of birds as well as doves bred in and about the palaces. As our officers and soldiers were admiring the beauty and flight of the hawk and talking upon the subject in general, Montezuma was curious to know what we were saying, which being explained to him, and also how we could tame hawks and fly them in our hands, Montezuma said that he would order the bird to be caught for us, and giving immediate directions for that purpose, by the next morning his hunters had caught and brought us the identical bird. Kakamatsin, the king's nephew, and the prince of the city of Tezcuco, the largest next to Mexico in the empire, having received information that the king had been now kept many days prisoner by the Spaniards, and that they had opened the treasury of his ancestors in order to secure it by a timely effort, convoked his vassals and also the neighboring princes. Amongst them was the lord of Matalchingo, a great warrior and near relation of Montezuma, who was said to have pretension to the throne. These princes and chiefs he summoned in order to induce them to assemble their forces and fall upon us in a body. When they were met in consultation upon this proposition, the prince whom I before mentioned to have had pretensions to the throne made the support of them the condition of his entering into the confederacy. Kakamatsin then brought forward a similar claim, declaring that he would go through the business with his own force, for which purpose he made arrangements with his friends in the city of Mexico. This coming to the knowledge of Montezuma, he immediately forbid any such steps being taken, and communicated to Cortes the information which he had received. The transaction was already in a certain degree known to us, but not to the full extent. Cortes, in consequence thereof, proposed to take with him a body of Mexicans to attack and destroy the city of Tezcuco, but this determination not being satisfactory to Montezuma, Cortes sent to Kakamatsin, desiring him to desist from his warlike preparations, as he wished for him as his friend. Kakamatsin replied that he was not to be duped like any others by plausible words, that he expelled soon to see us, that we might say to him that which we would. Cortes once again lent to Kakamatsin warning not to proceed to hostilities, the consequence of which would be the loss of the king's life, to which his chief returned for answer that neither the king nor Cortes were of any consequence to him, for that he was determined to persevere in his intentions. He had at this time a brother in Mexico, who had been obliged to fly thither on account of a family quarrel. This being known to us, our general proposed to Montezuma to call the reigning prince to his court, where we could seize on and detain him until he became more amenable, or if we thought proper, elevate the brother now in Mexico to his place. Montezuma agreed to send for him, adding that if he refused to come, he would give directions for having him brought by force. For this Cortes returned him thanks with many professions of sincere regard, alluring him that he rayed by him entirely for his protection, and that for his part he should be happy to accompany him to his palace, and that he could not get his captains to consent to it. The king thanked him, and said that he would immediately send to inform Kakamatsin of his true situation, and how it was adopted by his own free will, and by the advice of his gods. For Montezuma was perfectly well acquainted with dissimulation practiced by Cortes, and that it was only done in order to sound him. Montezuma, according to his promise, sent a message to the prince, who perfectly understood the manner in which it was obtained, and declared his determination to attack us in 4 days, saying that his uncle the king was a pitiful monarch, and no better than a hen, for not having attacked us as he advised him at the pass of Chalco. That for his part he was determined to avenge the wrongs that had been committed on us upon Montezuma and the country, that if in doing the throne of Mexico fell to his lot, he would liberally reward those who supported him. Some of the chiefs who had heard these declarations had scruples upon the subject, objecting to go to war without the orders of their sovereign. This filled the prince with rage, especially when they proposed to send to him for his instructions, and he caused 3 of them to be taken prisoners, and the others who were present, intimidated thereby, declared their determination to support him. He then sent a message to Montezuma representing the disgrace in which he was fallen, by connecting himself with wizards and magicians, and that he would come and put us all to death. Montezuma was highly offended at this, and taking off a seal, he entrusted it to the care of 6 of his captains, commanding them to go and shew it to certain persons who he named, as knowing they were not on terms of friendship with the prince, and to signify them his orders, that they should seize Kakamatsin and send him to his presence. Accordingly, they entered where the prince was, discoursing with some of his chiefs relative to his expedition, and having secured him, together with 5 others, embarking them in a piragua, they brought him to Mexico, where Kakamatsin was placed in one of the royal litters and conducted into the presence of Montezuma. The king, after having reproached him for his disobedience and treason, delivered him to Cortes to do what he thought proper with him, releasing the other prisoners. Cortes thanked the great Montezuma and made arrangements that the brother of Kakamatsin should succeed the principality by the name of Don Carlos, and he was accordingly invested with his dignity in the presence of Montezuma. The other chiefs who had joined in the measures of Cacamatzin absented themselves from court through fear, but were shortly made prisoners and brought to Mexico in chains. Thus was concluded this important business to our entire satisfaction. We continued still paying our court to Montezuma in the manner so great and generous a prince deserved, never sitting down, not even Cortez himself, in his presence until the king commanded it. The conversation frequently turned upon our holy religion, and the truths thereof seemed to be every day making more impression upon the king's mind. Cortez now entered again upon the subject of Montezuma's acknowledging the sovereignty of our emperor, to which Montezuma replied that he would summon the princes of his vassals, which he accordingly did, and nearly the whole of them attended within the space of 10 days. Among the few who absented themselves was the relation of Montezuma's already spoken of, and as of extraordinary prowess in war, who returned for answer that he would neither come or pay any more tribute. The king was incensed at this, and sent officers to apprehend him, but without success. The princes being assembled, and the little page present, Montezuma reminded them of the ancient prophecies, whereby they were told that from these parts where the sun rises, men were to come to rule the country, and that with their arrival should seize the empire of the Mexicans. The king added that for his part he believed we were the people spoken of, that he had sacrificed to his gods, requesting in vain an answer from them, but they referred him to the former ones, and commanded him to ask no more, whereby he concluded their will to be that obedience should be yielded to the king of Castile, for whom these strangers were vassals. I now, continued he, beseech you to give them some token of submission. They require it of me. Let no one refuse. For 18 years that I have reigned, I have been a kind monarch to you. You have been faithful subjects to me. Since my gods will have it so, indulge me by this one instance of obedience. The princes, with many sighs and tears, promised Montezuma, who was still more affected than them, that they would do whatever he desired. He then sent a message to Cortez, telling him that on the ensuing day he and his princes would tender their allegiance to his majesty our emperor. This they accordingly did at the time appointed, in the presence of all our officers, many of our soldiers, not one of whom who could refrain from weeping, in beholding the agitation and distress of the great and generous Montezuma. Cortez and his captains being in the presence of Montezuma, conversing about indifferent subjects, the general took an opportunity to ask some questions relative to the gold mines. Montezuma told him that the richest were in the province of Zacatuala, and he gave an account of the manner in which the gold was obtained, and which was, by washing the earth, the small grains of metal sinking to the bottom. He also informed Cortez that they obtained it in 2 rivers in the province of Guertepeque, where the natives did not obey him, but that if Cortez would send some troops thither, he could order his officers to conduct them. Cortez thanked the king, and pitched upon the pilot of Umbria and 2 soldiers to examine the mines of Zacatula. To those in the Chincantecan and Zapotecan territories he sent a captain named Pizarro, a young man, his relation. But at the time the names Pizarro and Peru were equally unknown. The latter took with him 4 soldiers used to mining, and 4 noble Mexicans. Montezuma then presented Cortez with a map admirably painted in cloth of the whole northern coast, so far as Tabasco, in extent 140 leagues. Among the rivers was that of Guacahualca, which Cortez determined to have examined, and Diego de Ordaz, offering himself, was accepted by Cortez contrary to his own inclination, as he was a person from whose advice and judgment he derived great advantage. Montezuma told de Ordaz that his departure, that his power did not extend to where he was going, and that if he wished for the assistance of his frontier garrisons, he was welcome to take them. The first who returned was Gonzalo de Umbria. He brought with him gold to the value of 300 crowns, and reported that the mines would be very valuable if they were as expert at business there as in Santo Domingo or Cuba. 2 principal persons in that country also attended him to Mexico, and brought a present of gold to about 100 crowns value, offering to become his majesty's subjects. Thus, having ascertained the situation of the mines was a matter of great satisfaction to Cortez. Umbria described the country in which he had been as very rich and populous, and indeed he and his companions seemed to have returned no way the worse for their journey, and Cortez intended that it should be so, in order to make up their former differences. Diego de Ordaz reported that he had passed through very populous districts, and had been universally well received, that he had met with bodies of the troops of Montezuma on the frontiers, of whose outrages the inhabitants made heavy complaints, for which de Ordaz severely reprehended the military chiefs, threatening them with the punishment of the Lord of Nahuatlan. Proceeding towards the river, he was hospitably received by the caciques and inhabitants of the neighboring country. On sounding the mouth of the river, they found 3 fathom water at low tide, in the shallowest part, and within the bar water sufficient for large ships, it still deepening as they went higher up. He also found a place fit for a naval establishment, where the natives came to him and offered themselves as vassals to his majesty, complaining bitterly of Montezuma and his officers. They also pointed out to our people the place where, in a late action, had killed many of his troops, which they had in consequence named Quilameque, which is to say the place of the slaughter of the Mexicans, giving to them a most opprobrious epithet. He further represented the soil of the country is fit for cattle and tillage, and the port is well situated for trade with Cuba, St. Domingo, and Jamaica, but disadvantageous in regard to his distance from Mexico and the morasses in its neighborhood. Pizarro mourned from Tustepeque with gold and grains to the value of 1,000 crowns. He related how he ascended into the mountains inhabited by the Chinkatecans, who sallied out under arms and refused to suffer the Mexicans to come to them, vowing that they would kill them if they attempted it. But our people were admitted willingly, and they obtained gold in its native place with a rough surface. Pizarro brought with him certain of the chiefs of the country, who wished to renounce the Mexican yoke and become subjects of his majesty. These Cortez received most kindly and dismissed to their homes with a promise of support and protection. He then inquired for other soldiers, to which Pizarro replied that the country being rich and the people well inclined to us, had left them to make a plantation of cocoa, to collect stock and birds, and also for the purpose of exploring the rivers and mines. Cortez said nothing at the time, but severely reprimanded him in private for going beyond his orders and employing the soldiers in such ridiculous pursuits. He also immediately sent off a messenger with orders for them to return to their headquarters. Cortez now demanded of Montezuma a general contribution of gold to be made through the whole extent of his territories to our emperor, and also that the king should deliver to us his treasure for the same purpose. Montezuma immediately sent his officers to those districts where the mines were, requiring a quantity of plates of gold, of the usual size paid in tribute, 2 of these being sent as a standard. He at this time, however, remarked to Cortez that for many of his districts gold was not to be expected in any considerable quantity, the people only possessing such toys as had been transmitted to them from their ancestors. Much gold was immediately transmitted from the rich provinces, but when the order was received by the refractory lord who was nearly related to Montezuma, the answer which was returned to us was he would pay no tribute, for that he had as good a right to the throne of Mexico as Montezuma himself. This greatly enraged the king, who immediately sending trusty officers with his token, the seal, they apprehended and brought this chief to Mexico. When he came into the presence of the king, he behaved with such insolence to him as appeared to border upon madness. And Cortez, learning of these particulars, and also that Montezuma had ordered him to be put to death, interceded in his favor and obtained leave to keep him in his custody. As soon as he had an interview, he addressed this chief very kindly and endeavored to make a friend of him, offering him his liberty, which, however, Montezuma would not accede to, but destined that he should be put in chains as others had been. In 20 days from the time of the orders being issued, the tribute was collected. The king then summoned Cortez with the captains and soldiers who usually formed his guard and addressed us, saying, "Know that I am indebted to your great king and esteem him, and for having sent an embassy to me from such a distance, and also because I am convinced that according to what we have heard from our ancestors, he is to rule us, a prophecy which is confirmed by the declarations of our gods. Take this gold, which is all that could be collected in so short a notice, and also the treasure which I derived from my ancestors, and for which I know you have seen. Send it to your monarch, and let it be recorded that in your annals that this was the tribute of his vassal Montezuma. I will give you, for your emperor, some most valuable jewels named calchicuis, each of which is worth 2 loads of gold. I will also send 3 tubes used for shooting darts or pellets, so richly adorned with jewels that he will be pleased to see them. For this which I now give is the last of the treasure which has remained with me." We all took off our helmets and returned thanks to the great Montezuma for his liberality and munificence, which Cortez promised he would represent in the strongest terms to his majesty. After some more conversation, Montezuma commanded his officers to deliver us the treasure which was in the concealed apartment. This was accordingly done, and we were for the space of 3 days constantly employed in taking it to pieces from the various manners in which it was worked up. In this we were assisted by the royal goldsmiths from Escapulazago. When thus separated, the articles of gold were formed in 3 heaps, weighing upwards of 600,000 crowns, exclusive of the various other valuables, the golden plates and bars, and the metal in its rough state from the mines. The goldsmiths melted down the metal which was in the heaps, and ran it into bars of the breadth of 3 fingers. When this was done, another present was received from Montezuma, so rich it was worthy of admiration, exclusive of the jewels called calchicuis, the ornamented tubes covered with jewels, and the pearls, and beautiful embroideries of pearls and feathers, and the panaches, or plumage, a recital whereof would be endless. The bars of gold were stamped with the imperial arms by the approbation of us all, and as to the rich ornaments, it was judged that they should not be taken to pieces. We also caused weights to be made of iron for the purpose of ascertaining the quality of the gold in the bars. They were not perfectly exact, but perhaps an ounce or more less, being arrobas, half arrobas, and down to 4 ounces. The officers of His Majesty valued the gold altogether, and exclusive of silver and ornaments, at 100 shares to the officers' ornaments, at 100,000 crowns, but some said it amounted to more. Nothing farther than thought necessary than to deduct His Majesty's fifth, and distribute the shares to officers and soldiers. Cortez, however, proposed that the division should be postponed until more treasure was brought in, with more exact weights made. But the soldiers were clamorous for an immediate division, and they perceived that since the various articles had been taken to pieces, above a third part was already gone, for Cortez, the captains, and others were conveying it off and concealing it. At length it was determined to weigh it, and to postpone the division until the ensuing day. It was accordingly so done, and exclusive of the ornaments and plates of gold, it was found to amount to upwards of 600,000 crowns. I will now relate how it was divided, and how most of it remained with Cortez and certain others. In the partition of the treasure, Cortez first laid aside His Majesty's fifth, secondly for himself another fifth, thirdly a portion of the gold to reimburse the expenses in the island of Cuba, and also for the naval expenditure incurred by Velasquez in the destruction of the ships, fourthly for the expenses of our agents in Spain, fifthly for our soldiers in Villarica, sixthly for the loss of killed horses, seventhly for the Reverend Father and the captains, eighthly double shares for the cavalry, musketeers, and crossbowmen. Thus by the time all these drafts were made, what remained for each shoulder was hardly worth stooping for. Many refused to take their shares, and the whole nearly remained with Cortez. We were obliged to be silent, for to whom could we appeal for justice? Some at length took their shares at 100 crowns, then cried out for more. These men's mouths Cortez stopped, giving privately a little to one and a little to another, with promises in abundance on condition they kept themselves quiet. That which was allotted to the soldiers in Villarica went no better, as shall be related in its place, and such was the result of the division of Montezuma's treasure. Our captains got chains of gold made for them by the king's workmen. Cortez also had similar works executed for him, together with a service of plate. Many of our soldiers who had lined their pockets well did the same, and deep gaming went on, day and night, with cards made out of the heads of drums, and thus we passed our time in Mexico. Quitting for the present the subject of Montezuma's gold badly divided and worse employed, I will relate what happened to a poor fellow, one Cardenas, a pilot and native of Triana. He had a wife and children, and like many others of us, little or nothing to give them. When he perceived that all that is this immense treasure of Montezuma's had dwindled into a share of 100 crowns, and that he, after all his battles, had nothing to expect in the future but hard blows, it made such an impression on him that he expressed himself so loudly that it could not but come to the ears of Cortez. Accordingly, when he heard all that, and much more, which had been said, he called us together, and in a long set speech gave us great many honeyed words, with which he had an extraordinary facility of doing, wondering how we could be so solicitous about a little paltry gold, when the whole country soon would be ours, with its rich mines, wherewith there was enough to make us great lords and princes, and I know not what. To the more loud he gave all some small presents, and to Cardenas he secretly promised to send 300 crowns for his wife and child. This Cardenas was afterwards very troublesome to him. As all men are avaricious, as with most the desire requiring increases with what they possess, and as it was well known that a great quantity of valuable pieces of gold was taken out of the treasury, suspicion naturally fell on several. Juan Velasquez de Leon, he had then some large chains of gold and trinkets and ornaments of that metal in the hands of the king's workmen, and the treasurer Mejia, knowing of it, and also how he had procured the gold, laid claim to them. But de Leon resisted, saying it had already been given to him by Cortez, before it was ran into bars, to which the treasurer replied that Cortez had concealed enough and taken enough from his soldiers already, without giving him so great a quantity. The quarrel rose so high between them, both being valiant men, that they drew their swords, and before they could be parted, each had received 2 wounds. Cortez, on hearing it, ordered them to be put to arrest and in chains. This he did to keep up appearances, having privately spoken to de Leon, who was his particular friend, and desired him to submit quietly, and the other he released in consideration of his office as treasurer. Velasquez was a strong man, and used to walk much backwards and forwards in the apartment where he was confined. Montezuma, hearing the rattling of his chains, inquired who it was, and being told, he interceded with Cortez for him on the first opportunity. Cortez, laughing, replied that Velasquez was a mad fellow, and if he did not keep him confined, he would go up and down the country robbing the Majesty's subjects of their gold. The good king said if it was only on that account that he was detained, he would supply his wants, and begged that he might be released. Cortez affected to make a favor of it, but at length agreed, declaring that he would banish him from his headquarters. Accordingly, he went as far as Cholula, but in 6 days returned, richer by the king's gold than he went. After this, Cortez and Mejia were never great friends. The king at this time made a proposal of marriage to Cortez, offering him one of the princesses, his daughters. This offer Cortez received as it merited, and suggested the propriety of her being previously initiated into the mysteries of our holy religion by being baptized, to which the king, who was on all occasions compliant, immediately assented. He, however, continued as attached as ever to his worship and sacrifices, which put Cortez and his captains to a dilemma, but it thought most consistent with their duties as Christians to incur the danger of insurrection and destroy the idols of the Mexicans in order to plant the true cross in their place, or if that was found impossible, we resolved to content ourselves for the present with making a chapel for the Christian worship in the temple. 7 officers and soldiers attended Cortez when he waited on Montezuma to signify to him our resolution. When it was made known to him, and he saw the violence with which the measure was determined to be carried into effect, he earnestly begged permission to consult his priests, and Cortez, appearing touched with his situation, made signs to the officers and soldiers to retire, and leave the king with him and the reverend father. He then told him that in order to accommodate the matter more to his satisfaction, he would endeavor to prevail with his officers for the present to offer no violence to the idols, provided a great part of the temple was appropriated for the purpose of a chapel, and an altar and crucifix allowed to be placed there, which being done once, his majesty would in short time be convinced of the errors and falsehood of his worship. To this Montezuma, with much agitation and the appearance of deep sorrow, heavily consented, and in consequence, an altar and crucifix being erected, Mass was solemnly said, and a person was appointed to take care of the chapel. The time of our stay in the city was one series of alarms, sufficient in themselves to have destroyed the lives of those who were not supported by the divine interposition. It appeared that in consequence of our late measure and the representations of the priests acting upon the prejudices of the people, our dangers were now thickening on us. Their gods threatened to leave them unless we were put to death for having violated their temple, and it was the determination to obey their will. This resolution was communicated to Montezuma by his priests and all his chief warriors, who, added to their religious subject to compliant, every other which they could collect relative to our conduct, find we arrived in Mexico. The page Ortegea also at this time came forward to inform Cortez of some alarming circumstances, such as a number of secret conferences which he had observed between Montezuma and his nobility and chiefs, the angry and melancholy countenance of the king, and other circumstances highly important and interesting to us. Cortez, immediately on hearing this, taking with him 5 of his captains and his interpreters, waited on Montezuma. The king seemed much distressed and informed him that he was grieved to have lately learned that it was the determination of his gods that we should all be put to death or expelled from Mexico. He therefore, being our sincere friend, recommended it to us on no account to run the risk, but to save our lives, whilst it could be done by a speedy retreat. Cortez and the rest could not conceal their uneasiness on hearing this, and no wonder. The general, however, immediately replied that he was on that occasion much grieved at 2 things. One was not having his vessels ready for the purpose of returning. The other, that in case of his doing so, he should be under the necessity of taking his majesty with him, in order to present him to his sovereign the emperor. He therefore entreated Montezuma that he would restrain his priests and warriors until he should have time to build 3 ships, saying if this were not acceded to, we were all resolved to die to the very last man. And as a proof of the sincerity of a determination to depart, he declared that he would immediately send his shipbuilders to fell wood and construct the vessels on the coast. The determination of Cortez to bring Montezuma with him made that monarch more distressed and dejected than ever. Cortez then repeated his assurance of no unnecessary delay and desired the assistance of the king's carpenters in constructing the vessels, at the same time requesting his influence with the priests and nobility to prevent any insurrection in the city, and his endeavors to appease his gods, provided it were not by human sacrifices. Cortez immediately proceeded to execute his determination of building 3 ships, contrary to what is related to by Gomara, who says that the whole was as feint, in order to lull Montezuma and his subjects. But on the contrary, Martin Lopez, the principal carpenter who is now living, has assured me that he really did, and in good earnest, set about the work, and that the vessels were actually on the stocks. During this time we remained very pensive and sad in the city of Mexico from the precariousness of our situation, expecting every moment to be attacked. Our apprehensions were increased by the informations obtained by Donna Marina and the terror and tears of the page, who, understanding the language, obtained hints which escaped our knowledge. We kept, however, good and constant watch on Montezuma, and guard on our quarters, never sleeping out of our armor, and our horses were constantly bridled and saddled all night. Without meaning to boast, I say of myself that my armor was to me as easy as the softest down, and such is my custom, that when I now go to the rounds of my district, I never take a bed with me unless I happen indeed to be attended by strange cavaliers, in which case I do it only in order to avoid the appearance of poverty or penuriousness, but by my faith, even when I have one, I always throw myself on it in my clothes. Such it is to be a true soldier. Another peculiarity I have is, I cannot sleep through the night, but always awaken and get up in order to contemplate the heavens and the stars, and thus amuse myself, walking backwards and forwards, as I used to do when on guard, for a good space of time, without hat or cap, and glory be to God, I never yet caught cold, nor was a jot the worse for it. And this the reader must pardon me for mentioning, if it not being from vanity, but that I wish to know what kind of men we, the true-bred soldiers and real conquerors of Mexico, were. Okay, that was the end of part 3. Look forward next week to part 4, which will contain the flight of Cortez and his soldiers from the city of Mexico and the eventual return of the conquistadors with their Indian allies to destroy the main city of the Mexicans, Tenochtitlan. Thank you for listening.